My name's Rachel Monroe. 4 months ago, my husband dropped my suitcase on the front porch, looked me in the eyes, and told me to get out of the house I helped build. I stood there in the rain, holding everything I owned in one bag, while the door I used to call home clicked shut behind me. 11 years of marriage. 11 years reduced to a suitcase and a locked door. People think divorce is the hard part. It isn't. The hard part is standing outside your own home, in the rain, realizing the man who promised to love you for better or worse just chose worse, and chose it without you. Trevor didn't just leave me, he humiliated me first. He told our neighbors I was lazy. He told his family I never contributed. He told me, standing right there in the doorway, that I would never be anything without him. He had no idea that 4 months later, the woman he threw out onto the street would be standing under studio lights, in front of millions of viewers, holding a check for $800 million. And he had no idea that somewhere across town, a television would be playing, and he'd be watching it happen live. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how I ended up on that porch, you have to understand how Trevor and I began. We met when I was 26, waiting tables at a diner off South Boulevard while finishing my associate's degree at night. He came in most mornings before his shift at a construction supply company, always ordered the same coffee, always left the same tip. It took him 3 months to ask for my number. It took me 3 seconds to say yes. Back then, Trevor was warm. He laughed easily. He noticed small things, like when I was tired or when I'd had a hard shift. We got married 2 years later in a backyard ceremony with folding chairs and a borrowed sound system. We didn't have money, but we had each other. And at the time, that felt like more than enough. For the first several years, it was enough. We rented a small duplex near Plaza Midwood. I worked my way up from waitressing into an office coordinator role at a medical supply company. Trevor worked construction, then moved into equipment sales, then eventually partnered with a man named Marcus to open a small commercial contracting business. Those early years were lean, but they were good. We ate dinner on a card table because we couldn't afford a real one. We drove a car with a check engine light that never turned off. We laughed about it. We called ourselves a team. I believed without question that whatever came next, we would face it together. Something shifted around year 7. Trevor's business with Marcus started bringing in real money, bigger contracts, commercial buildings, a few municipal projects, and with the money came a different version of Trevor. He started talking about other men in his circle, men who drove certain trucks, men whose wives didn't work, men who took vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. He stopped asking about my day. He started asking why I hadn't gone back for my bachelor's degree, why I still worked some office job, why I hadn't done more with myself. I told myself it was stress. I told myself business ownership was hard, and he'd go back to being himself once things settled. Things never settled. They only got worse. By year 9, the comments had a pattern. If I mentioned something at my job, he'd change the subject to a client of his who just closed a 7-figure deal. If I suggested a modest vacation, he'd say we should wait until we could do it right, the way his associate Marcus did it. He started comparing me to Marcus's wife, a woman named Diane who didn't work, and spent her afternoons at a country club Trevor had recently joined without asking me. He'd come home from those afternoons and look around our house like it embarrassed him. I remember him standing in our kitchen one evening, looking at our second-hand table, and saying, quietly, almost to himself, "We should really upgrade this place. Not we should upgrade our finances together. Just upgrade, as if I was part of what needed replacing. The arguments started small and grew large, the way arguments do when neither person is willing to name what's actually wrong. He'd criticize how I loaded the dishwasher. I'd criticize how late he came home from client dinners. He started spending more evenings out, always with Marcus, always with vague explanations. I found myself checking his location on a shared app I'd forgotten we still had, then feeling ashamed for checking, then checking again anyway. I want to be honest. I don't know for certain if there was another woman during those years. I never found proof. What I found instead was distance, the kind that grows so gradually you don't notice how far apart you've drifted until the gap is impossible to cross. 11 years in, I stopped recognizing the man I'd married. He'd started working out obsessively, buying clothes he never used to care about, correcting the way I spoke in front of his business associates. One night at a dinner with Marcus and Diane, I mentioned that I was thinking about taking an online course to move into a supervisor role at work. Trevor laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, and said, "Baby, you don't need to worry about all that." I remember Diane glancing at me with something that looked like pity. I remember feeling my face grow hot. I said nothing that night. I said nothing for a long time. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the marriage. The morning everything ended started like any other. I made coffee. I packed my lunch for work. Trevor came downstairs already dressed, which was unusual for a Saturday. He sat across from me at the table and said, without any preamble, "I want a divorce." I remember laughing, actually laughing, because it felt like a joke, or a test, or something he'd take back in a moment. He didn't take it back. I asked him to explain himself, and for the first time in months, he actually did. He said he'd been unhappy for years, not months, years, and that he'd simply gotten better at hiding it than I'd gotten at noticing it. I asked him why he'd never said anything, why he'd let me believe we were simply going through a rough patch that would eventually pass. He looked at me, almost pityingly, and said, "Because you never would have understood. You've always been comfortable with just enough, Rachel." I stopped being comfortable with just enough a long time ago. I felt something in my chest tighten at the word comfortable, as though wanting stability, wanting a home that felt safe, rather than a life that felt impressive, was some kind of personal failing. I asked him if there was someone else. He hesitated just long enough for the hesitation itself to answer the question, then said, "That's not what this is about." I didn't push further that morning. Some part of me didn't want to know, not yet, not while the rest of my life was already collapsing in front of me. He said, and I remember this exactly, "I need a partner who can keep up with where I'm going, not someone who's comfortable standing still." I asked him what that meant, my voice barely holding steady. He said it meant he'd already spoken to a lawyer, that he'd been speaking with one for nearly 2 months, quietly gathering documents, quietly separating our finances in ways I hadn't noticed, because I had never once imagined I needed to be watching for them. He told me this the way a person announces a business decision, calm, prepared, already 3 steps ahead of the conversation we were supposedly having together for the first time. Over the following weeks, I learned that Trevor had been planning his exit for months, possibly longer. The house was solely in his name, a fact I'd never questioned because we'd bought it during a stretch when my credit was recovering from an old medical bill. The business was his and Marcus's, structured in a way that gave me no claim to it. Our joint savings had quietly shrunk over the past year. Money he explained away as business reinvestment. My name was on almost nothing. I sat in a lawyer's office, a lawyer I could barely afford, and learned that 11 years of marriage had left me with almost no legal ground to stand on. The lawyer's exact words were, "This is going to be difficult." I didn't fully understand how difficult until the day Trevor asked me to leave. He didn't ask gently. 4 months ago, on a Tuesday evening, Trevor came home while I was in the middle of packing a few boxes of things I planned to move to my sister's house temporarily while we sorted out the details. He walked into the bedroom, saw the boxes, and something in his face changed. He said the house needed to be his space now, that the lawyers were handling everything anyway, and that I should just go stay with Denise instead of dragging this out. I told him I needed a few more days. He said no. Within the hour, he had pulled my suitcase from the closet himself, packed it faster and more carelessly than I ever would have, and carried it to the front door. I stood in the living room, stunned, watching the man I'd shared a decade with treat my belongings like inconvenient clutter. I asked him to slow down, to talk about this like adults. He told me there was nothing left to talk about. He opened the front door. Outside, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and a light rain had started to fall. He set my suitcase on the porch, looked at me, and said the words I will never forget as long as I live. "Maybe now you'll figure out how to actually build something on your own." Then he stepped back inside, and the door clicked shut, and I heard the deadbolt turn. I stood on that porch for a long time before I moved. The rain grew heavier. My hair stuck to my face. Cars passed on the street behind me, their headlights cutting through the gray evening, and none of them slowed down, because from the outside, nothing about that moment looked unusual. Just a woman standing in the rain with a suitcase. Nobody could have known that inside that suitcase was 11 years of my life, folded into whatever fit, and that behind me was a locked door that used to be my front door in a house I used to call home. I finally picked up the suitcase, walked to my car, and sat behind the wheel for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I drove straight to my sister Denise's apartment across town. She opened the door, took one look at me soaked through and shaking, and didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me inside and held on to me while I cried harder than I think I'd ever cried in my life. Not because of the house, not because of the money I knew I'd probably never see. I cried because somewhere along the way, I had built my entire sense of worth around being chosen by someone, and that night, I learned exactly how easily that choice could be reversed. I stayed on Denise's pull-out couch that night, staring at her ceiling, wondering how 11 years could disappear behind a single deadbolt. The weeks that followed felt like moving through fog. I filed for what I could through the divorce proceedings, though my lawyer was honest that Trevor's assets were largely protected, structured years in advance in ways that left me very little. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place with thin walls and a window unit that rattled all night. My furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a folding table, and 2 chairs Denise had given me from her garage. I remember sitting on that mattress my first night alone, looking around at 4 bare walls and thinking that at 44 years old, I was starting over with less than I'd had at 26. Work became the only place I felt like myself. I'd been an office coordinator for 12 years at the same medical supply company, and my coworkers, especially a woman named Priya from billing, noticed something was wrong before I said a word. Priya started leaving coffee on my desk without comment. My supervisor quietly adjusted my schedule when I needed a morning off for court dates. Small kindnesses from people who barely knew the details, but who could see I was struggling. I never told most of them the full story. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to be the woman everyone whispered about in the break room. So I smiled, did my work, and fell apart privately. In my car, in my apartment, in the shower where no one could hear. Money became a constant weight. My share of the divorce settlement, after legal fees, barely covered my new rent and a security deposit. I sold my wedding ring, not out of anger, but out of necessity, and used the money to cover 2 months of groceries and a car repair I couldn't avoid. I remember standing at a pawn shop counter watching a stranger examine the ring Trevor had once slid onto my finger with such certainty and feeling nothing but a strange, hollow relief when the transaction was finished. It wasn't sentimental anymore. It was just gold, worth exactly what it was worth, which turned out to be considerably less than the promise it once represented. The hardest part wasn't the apartment, or the mattress on the floor, or the sound of my own car's check engine light returning like an old, unwelcome friend. The hardest part was the silence. For 11 years, even during the bad stretches, there had been another person in the house, another voice, another set of footsteps. Now there was nothing. I'd come home from work to an empty apartment, heat up something simple, and sit in silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I started leaving the television on just for noise, not because I watched it, but because the silence had become unbearable in a way I hadn't expected. Then came the social media posts. I want to be honest about this part because it's ugly, and it's human, and I know many of you watching have done the same thing. I followed Trevor's accounts, and Diane's, and a few mutual friends who'd sided with him after the split. Within weeks, photos appeared. Trevor at a rooftop event downtown. Trevor with a new watch. Trevor smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The captions talked about new beginnings and leveling up. Comments poured in from people I used to consider friends, telling him he deserved this fresh start. I sat alone in my apartment scrolling through proof that his life had improved the exact moment mine had collapsed, and I felt something inside me curdle into a kind of grief I didn't have a name for. One evening, about 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, my sister Denise sat me down at her kitchen table and said something I still think about. She said, "Rachel, you can spend the next year watching his life, or you can spend it building yours. He doesn't get both your marriage and your future." I didn't respond well that night. I told her she didn't understand, that it was easy for her to talk when her own marriage was stable, when she wasn't the one starting over with nothing. She let me be angry. She didn't argue. She just refilled my coffee and sat with me until I calmed down enough to hear what she'd actually said. I deleted the social media apps from my phone the following week. It didn't fix everything, but it stopped the daily reopening of a wound that needed time to close. I started walking in the mornings before work, just around my apartment complex at first, then further, along a greenway near my new neighborhood. I didn't do it to lose weight or prove anything to anyone. I did it because moving my body was the only thing that quieted my mind, even for 20 minutes. I started reading again, mostly library books, mostly at night when the silence pressed in hardest. Small routines. Nothing dramatic, but they were mine, chosen by me, for me, and after years of shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations, that mattered more than I can explain. Around the start of the 3rd month, I had a night I still think about often, because it was the closest I came to fully giving up. I'd worked a full shift, come home to my quiet apartment, and discovered my window unit had finally stopped working during one of the hottest weeks of the year. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the heat, sweat mixing with tears I couldn't seem to stop, and I called Denise, not because I expected her to fix anything, but because I simply couldn't sit in that silence alone for one more minute. She didn't say much on the phone. She just told me to pack a bag and come stay with her for a few days while I figured out the air conditioning situation. When I arrived, She'd already made up her guest room, already had a fan running, already had a plate of food waiting on the counter, as though she'd known exactly what state I'd be in before I even walked through her door. We sat up late that night, and for the first time since the divorce, I let myself say out loud the thought I'd been carrying in silence. I told her I was starting to believe Trevor might have been right about me, that maybe I really was someone who was only ever going to be comfortable standing still. Denise set down her coffee, looked at me directly, and said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Rachel, standing still isn't the same as being stuck. You've kept every promise you ever made to that man for 11 years. The only thing you're guilty of is loving someone who stopped deserving it a long time before you noticed." I didn't believe her that night, not fully, but I held on to those words anyway, the way you hold on to anything solid when everything else feels like it's dissolving beneath you. Looking back now, I think that conversation, more than anything else, was the actual turning point, long before any lottery ticket ever entered the picture. By the third month, something in me had shifted from grief into something closer to determination. Not because I had a plan for greatness. I had no idea what my future looked like, but I was tired, deeply tired, of feeling like a woman things happen to, instead of a woman making decisions. I picked up extra shifts at work when they were offered. I started setting aside whatever small amount I could each week, $10, $20, whatever was left after rent and bills. It wasn't much. It wasn't going to change my circumstances in any meaningful way, but it was proof to myself that I could still choose to build something, even from almost nothing. There was one particular afternoon, about a week before everything changed, that I think about often, because it captured exactly how small my world had become. A new supervisor had started at the medical supply company, a woman about 10 years younger than me, and during a team meeting she referred to me, by accident, as the woman who covers the front desk, not realizing I'd been coordinating logistics for that office for over a decade. Nobody corrected her. I sat there in that meeting, in a blouse I'd owned for 6 years, calculating in my head whether I could afford to replace the heel that had snapped on my shoe that morning, and I felt something inside me quietly break in a way that had nothing to do with Trevor at all. I went to the restroom after that meeting and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, looking at a woman I barely recognized, not because she looked different, but because she looked so tired. I remember thinking, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that somewhere along the way I had become invisible, not just to Trevor, but to almost everyone, including myself. I splashed water on my face, reapplied what little makeup I still owned, and walked back out to finish my shift, because that was what the version of me back then knew how to do. Survive the day, show up tomorrow, repeat. That evening I sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home, staring at the steering wheel, wondering when exactly I had stopped being someone people noticed. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I think I had simply run out of tears that particular week. I just sat there in silence, feeling the specific, hollow exhaustion of a woman who has spent her whole life taking care of everyone else's expectations and has almost nothing left over for her own. It was against that backdrop, less than a week later, that I found myself standing in a gas station with $51 to my name. One Friday evening near the end of that third month, I stopped at a gas station on my way home from a double shift. I was exhausted in the particular way that comes from being on your feet for 10 hours while carrying grief you haven't had time to process. My tank was nearly empty, and so was my patience. While the pump ran, I went inside to grab a bottle of water, and I checked my bank balance out of habit. $51. That was what stood between me and my next paycheck. 5 days away. I stood there under the fluorescent lights doing quiet math in my head, the exhausting arithmetic of survival that had become my new normal. Beside the register stood a lottery display, brightly lit, advertising a jackpot that had grown for weeks without a winner. I'd walked past those displays my entire adult life without a second thought. Lottery tickets had always seemed to me like a tax on desperation, a truth Trevor himself used to repeat whenever we passed one together, back when he still said things like, "we," and meant it. But that evening, standing there with $51 to my name and a jackpot flashing $800 million across the screen, something in me paused. I don't know if it was exhaustion or grief or some small flicker of hope refusing to fully die. I asked the cashier for a single ticket. She rang it up without much interest, the way cashiers do 100 times a day. I paid with cash I genuinely couldn't spare, slid the ticket into my wallet, and walked back out to my car feeling faintly foolish. As I drove home, I laughed quietly at myself, the way you laugh at your own small, hopeless indulgences. I told myself the odds were astronomical, that nobody I would ever know had won anything larger than $50 on a scratch-off, and that this ticket would join the countless others discarded in gas station trash cans across the country. I had no idea that the thin piece of paper sitting in my wallet was about to change absolutely everything. 3 days passed in their usual rhythm: work, silence, small routines. I'd nearly forgotten about the ticket entirely, tucked behind an old receipt in my wallet. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was on my lunch break at work, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a telemarketer, but something made me answer. A woman's voice greeted me, calm and professional, introducing herself as Angela from the State Lottery Commission. My stomach tightened immediately, my mind jumping to scam warnings I'd read online. I nearly hung up. Then she read back the exact serial number printed on my ticket, and I felt every muscle in my body go still. I asked her how she had that information. She explained, patiently, that the number matched a winning ticket sold at the gas station I'd visited 3 days earlier, and that she needed to confirm my identity for verification purposes. I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because my brain genuinely could not process what she was telling me. I told her she likely had the wrong person, that these things didn't happen to people like me. She said, gently but firmly, that according to their records, I was the sole holder of the winning ticket for a jackpot of $800 million. The break room around me seemed to disappear. I heard my own pulse before I heard anything else. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I remember sitting in the break room afterward, staring at the vending machine across from me, feeling like the entire world had tilted slightly off its axis. I pulled the ticket from my wallet with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and stared at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something more believable. Priya found me still sitting there 20 minutes later, my lunch untouched, and asked if I was all right. I couldn't even form the words to explain. I simply handed her my phone, showed her the missed call log, and watched her face shift from concern to disbelief to something close to shock. That night, I barely slept. I checked the ticket every hour, terrified it would somehow disappear, terrified I had imagined the entire phone call, terrified I would wake up and discover I was still exactly where I'd been that morning, $51 from empty. I called Denise near midnight, my voice shaking so badly she thought something terrible had happened. When I finally managed to explain, she went silent on the other end of the line for almost 10 full seconds before she started crying, right there over the phone, saying my name over and over, like she needed to confirm I was real. The following morning, I drove to the Lottery Commission's regional office with the ticket sealed inside a plastic bag, as though it might dissolve if exposed to open air for too long. The building was larger and more official than I expected, all glass and quiet hallways and staff who treated me with a careful, practiced calm that told me this was not their first time handling someone in shock. I was led into a private room where my identity was verified, the ticket was examined under specialized lighting, and every detail was cross-checked against their records not once, but 3 separate times. Angela, the woman who'd called me, sat across from me through most of it, offering water I couldn't bring myself to drink. After nearly 2 hours, a man in a gray suit entered the room carrying a folder, sat down across from me, and said the words that finally made everything real. "Congratulations, Mrs. Monroe. Your ticket is authentic. You are the sole winner of an $800 million jackpot." I closed my eyes. 4 months earlier, I had been standing in the rain outside a house that no longer belonged to me, holding a suitcase that contained everything I owned. Now I was sitting in a quiet office, being told I was one of the wealthiest women in the entire country. The distance between those 2 moments felt impossible to measure. News of the win spread with a speed I wasn't prepared for. Within a day, reporters had identified me, and within a week, my phone was flooded with requests from local news stations, then national outlets, then producers from a major television network who wanted me to appear live during a primetime special segment. At first, I refused every single request. I had spent 4 months trying to disappear quietly into a smaller life, and the idea of standing in front of cameras felt unbearable. But a financial advisor Denise helped me find gently explained that controlling my own narrative mattered, that if I didn't tell my story, tabloids and strangers would tell it for me, likely inaccurately, likely cruelly. Reluctantly, I agreed to one appearance. The day of the broadcast arrived faster than I felt prepared for. I was picked up by a car service and driven to a studio downtown, somewhere I'd walked past 100 times without ever imagining I'd enter through its front doors as a guest. Hair and makeup staff worked around me while producers reviewed timing sheets and camera positions. I sat in a small dressing room afterward, staring at my own reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back. 4 months earlier, that woman had been soaked in rain, shaking, humiliated on her own front porch. The woman in the mirror now sat straighter. Her eyes held something different. Not arrogance, just the quiet steadiness that comes only from surviving something you once believed might break you completely. The host greeted me warmly just before we went live, and I remember taking one slow breath as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The studio lights came up, the audience settled, and my heart pounded so loudly I was certain the microphones would pick it up. The interview moved through my background gently at first, questions about my life, my work, before turning, inevitably, toward the divorce. I chose not to name Trevor directly and not to dwell on cruelty for its own sake. I simply said that 4 months earlier, I had been asked to leave my home with very little and that I had rebuilt from almost nothing. The audience grew quiet in a way that felt respectful rather than pitying. Then came the moment the entire broadcast had been building toward. Stage crew wheeled out a ceremonial check bearing the number $800 million, and the studio audience rose to their feet, applauding, some visibly emotional. I stood there under the lights, holding that check, and felt something inside me finally exhale after 4 months of holding my breath. Cameras captured the moment from every angle, broadcasting it live into millions of homes across the country. I had no idea, in that exact moment, that one of those homes belonged to Trevor. Across town, inside the newer, larger house Trevor had moved into after our divorce, he was hosting a small gathering with Marcus, Diane, and a handful of business associates he'd been courting for a new commercial project. The television played quietly in the background, tuned to the same network airing my interview, until someone in the room glanced up and froze. According to what I later learned from a mutual acquaintance who was present that evening, a woman turned to Trevor and asked, with visible confusion, whether the woman on screen was his ex-wife. The room reportedly went silent as every head turned toward the television. Trevor, by every account I've since heard, simply stared at the screen without speaking. There I was, under bright studio lights, composed and steady, holding a check for $800 million, describing, without naming him, the man who had put my suitcase on the porch in the rain and told me I would never build anything on my own. Marcus later admitted, in a conversation Denise happened to overhear at a mutual event months afterward, that Trevor didn't say a single word for nearly 10 full minutes. He simply sat there, phone buzzing repeatedly beside him, as friends and family began texting him the exact same clip from every direction. According to Marcus, Diane was the first to speak, asking Trevor directly whether the interview was about him. He reportedly gave no answer at all, which, in a room full of people who knew our history, was answer enough. One of the business associates present that evening, a woman Trevor had been courting for a new contract, later mentioned to a mutual friend that she remembered the specific silence in that room, how quickly the mood shifted from celebration to something closer to discomfort, as though everyone present had suddenly recalculated something about the man hosting the party. Marcus said Trevor left the room shortly afterward and didn't return for the rest of the evening, leaving his own guests standing in his living room, unsure whether to keep watching or quietly let themselves out. I never asked for that kind of reckoning. I want to be honest about that. I didn't build my story around humiliating him publicly, and I never named him on air, not because I was protecting him, but because I understood, even in that moment, that his character would eventually speak for itself far more convincingly than anything I could say about him. Some truths don't need to be announced. They simply need time and a room full of witnesses to reveal themselves. The broadcast spread online almost immediately, clipped and shared across platforms within hours. Because I'd been careful not to name Trevor, most viewers didn't know the specific identity of the man in the story. But those who knew us personally, former neighbors, mutual friends, people who had witnessed the way he'd treated me in those final years, understood exactly who I was describing. Word moved quickly through our old social circle, and I later learned that Trevor found himself fielding uncomfortable questions from his own business associates, some of whom had grown wary of a man capable of discarding his wife so publicly and so coldly, especially once her resilience became public knowledge in the most visible way imaginable. In the weeks following the broadcast, my life transformed in ways I could barely process. Financial advisors, attorneys, and wealth managers all reached out, each with their own advice about protecting and growing what I'd won. I listened carefully, but I made a promise to myself early on that the money would not change who I was at my core. The first thing I did was pay off every debt I carried, including the small loan I'd taken out just to cover moving costs after Trevor put me out. Then I helped Denise pay off her own mortgage, something she'd never asked for and initially refused, until I insisted, reminding her that she'd been the one who opened her door to me on the worst night of my life. After that, I bought a modest home, not extravagant, not designed to impress anyone, just a quiet house with good light and a yard I could sit in without anyone telling me it needed to be upgraded. I furnished it slowly, choosing pieces I actually loved rather than pieces meant to signal anything to anyone. I began donating to a local women's shelter, one that had, coincidentally, helped several women in situations similar to mine over the years. I funded scholarships for adult students returning to school later in life, the kind of opportunity I'd once been quietly discouraged from pursuing myself. Those contributions brought me a kind of satisfaction no purchase ever could. Success, I learned quickly, reveals people's true character in ways ordinary life rarely does. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my birthday. Former co-workers who'd never once invited me to lunch began requesting meetings. I received messages from people asking for loans, investments, or simply a small favor. People who had shown no interest in my well-being during the hardest months of my life, but now seemed deeply invested in my success. I learned to recognize the difference quickly, and I learned to protect my peace without guilt, something I wish I'd understood far earlier in my life. Roughly 8 months after the broadcast, on a quiet evening while I sat on my back patio watching the sky shift into shades of orange and violet, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wasn't anticipating anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it entirely. Something told me to answer. When I opened the door, I found Trevor standing there, and for several long seconds, neither of us said a single word. He looked different than I remembered, smaller somehow, though nothing about his physical appearance had changed. Gone was the confidence he'd carried the night he set my suitcase on the porch. In its place was something uncertain, almost fragile. He said my name quietly, almost like a question. I asked if he wanted to come in, more out of habit than genuine warmth, and he nodded. We sat across from each other in my living room, the silence between us heavy with everything neither of us had said in months. Eventually, Trevor spoke. He said he'd made a mistake, that the business with Marcus had begun struggling not long after the divorce. Several key clients quietly distancing themselves once word spread about how he'd treated me. He explained that 2 of their largest municipal contracts had gone to competing firms in the months following the broadcast, and that Marcus himself had grown distant, uncomfortable being associated with a partner whose personal life had become a cautionary tale among people they both needed to keep doing business with. He said Diane had eventually left him too, quietly, months after my own story became public, telling him she'd started to wonder what he might one day decide she deserved as well. He said watching the broadcast had forced him to confront things about himself he'd spent years avoiding. He admitted that he'd convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that ambition meant discarding anything that felt ordinary, including me, including the version of himself that used to bring me coffee at that diner without needing anyone's approval to do it. He said he'd spent so many years chasing a life that looked successful to other people that he'd forgotten to ask whether it actually felt like anything at all. He said the words I imagine he'd rehearsed many times before finally arriving at my door. I was wrong about you, Rachel. I was wrong about everything. I listened without interrupting, watching a man who had once made me feel small now sitting in my home, visibly humbled. Part of me, the part still healing from 4 months of standing in metaphorical rain long after that literal night, felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction. But a larger part of me simply felt tired, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've carried for far too long. When he finished speaking, he asked, quietly, if there was any chance we could try again. I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted my response to come from clarity rather than anger. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, because carrying resentment for the rest of my life felt like handing him power over me all over again. but I explained that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I told him that he hadn't left because our marriage was struggling. He left because he stopped believing struggle and loyalty could coexist. I told him that anyone can stand beside you when life is easy. The truth of a person reveals itself in how they behave when things are hard, and he had already shown me exactly who he was in that moment on the porch. Trevor's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago at that diner off South Boulevard. But that man had made his choice a long time before he ever packed my suitcase, and I had made mine the moment I picked that suitcase up off the wet concrete and refused to let it define the rest of my life. He nodded slowly, thanked me for hearing him out, and stood to leave. At the door, he paused and said quietly, "Congratulations, Rachel. Not for the money, for who you became without me." Then he walked to his car and drove away, and I closed the door behind him without any of the pain that door had once carried. I returned to my patio and sat quietly as the last light faded from the sky, thinking about everything that had unfolded since that rainy evening 4 months, and later, a full year before. The divorce, the silence, the mattress on the floor, the $51, the ticket I almost didn't buy, the broadcast, the reconciliation I chose not to accept. Sitting there, I understood something I don't think I could have understood any other way. The money changed my circumstances, but it never repaired what mattered most, my sense of my own worth. And that had actually been rebuilt long before Angela ever called me with news of the jackpot. It had been rebuilt on quiet mornings walking alone, on nights reading library books in silence, on the decision to keep showing up for myself when no one else was showing up for me. The greatest thing I gained was never the $800 million. It was discovering that my value was never dependent on being chosen by someone else. It was there all along, waiting patiently through every hard season, waiting for me to finally recognize it myself. And sometimes, the most painful ending in your life isn't the tragedy it feels like in the moment. Sometimes it's the door that finally closes so a much larger one can open, one you never would have found the courage to walk through if you'd still been standing safely behind the smaller one, waiting for someone else to let you in. If Trevor had never opened that door and put my suitcase out in the rain, I might never have discovered the strength that had been inside me the entire time. And that lesson, the quiet, hard-earned understanding that I was always enough exactly as I was worth far more than any check I've ever held under studio lights. So I'll leave you with the same question I still ask myself some evenings, sitting on that patio, watching the sky change color the way it did the night Trevor showed up at my door. If the person who once made you feel small showed up tomorrow, humbled, sorry, and asking for another chance, would you let them back in? Or would you finally choose yourself, the way it took me 11 years, 1 suitcase, and $800 million to learn how to do? Tell me in the comments what you would do. I read every single one, and I genuinely love to know. Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one, and we'd love to hear which part of tonight's story hit you the hardest. Let us know if this particular story managed to keep you with us for the entire runtime. You're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, like and turn on the notification bell for more powerful stories filled with shocking twists, family drama, family betrayals, hidden secrets, and unforgettable endings. Thanks for watching. Until the next unforgettable story, love you all.